So this morning, Dr. Ward had a opportunity, or rather the Los Alamos National Laboratory had an opportunity to hear his thoughts, and I know you are going to be really pleased and have an engaging lot to think about. We're really also delighted that Jonathan is here today, because you're going to hear very strong thoughts, and then in 2 weeks, we want you to come back and hear David Farstein, who is also very knowledgeable about China, but will have a different perspective. And then probably what we should do, Sean, is have our members together and have a real debate on everything. Let me just read a quote from Henry Kissinger that was in The Economist 2 weeks ago. Dr. Kissinger said, "We're in the classic pre-World War I situation where neither side has much margin of political concession, in which any disturbance of the equilibrium can lead to catastrophic consequences." So I'm going to ask Jonathan what he thinks about that, but first let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Ward. His second book, or is this your third book?
Second plus a PhD.
Second plus a PhD, The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph Over China. He is the president and founder of the Atlas organization, which is a consultancy that has advised a number of U.S. government organizations and agencies, primarily in the defense sector, as well as he advises a great number of Fortune 100 and 500 companies. His doctorate was awarded by the University of Oxford, where his PhD focused on the relationship between China and India. But my first question to you, Jonathan, is how did you get involved in this? I've heard a little bit, but you had a lot of fun in your early 20s.
Well, fair enough. Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon, and it's wonderful to be in New Mexico. My first time here. It's very beautiful, and it hopefully will not be the last time. So my background, in addition to the academic work, in addition to being a business owner and advisor, both to U.S. government and to many American corporations, I was most importantly a linguist when I was in my 20s and teens. So I grew up learning Spanish and French. Then when I got to college, I had to make the decision between Russian, Chinese, and Arabic. Wound up doing all three, spending about 5 years living and traveling all over China, India, Latin America, Middle East, learned Syrian and Egyptian, did Russian and Chinese at Columbia, and then in Beijing University, St. Petersburg State University in Russia. So was very immersed in languages and travel in my 20s, and that's how I got really into the subject of major powers and major power competition, which today is the geopolitical framework that we're going to live in. And for me, it was just curiosity about the large countries and the hard languages, and wanting to go see a world that was different from the one, honestly, that I'd been told existed. My great uncle was in the OSS, which was a precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was later head of the English department at New York University, sort of an interesting combination, an Italian immigrant who'd fought on the U.S. side in the war in the OSS. And he said to me when I graduated from Columbia and had just done Russian and Chinese language, he gave me Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat and said, "I don't understand this anymore. Why don't you go see if this is true?" And so when I just left Columbia, I took the Trans-Siberian Railway from Moscow to Beijing through Mongolia. And it was pretty obvious to me, just in that week on a train, and I'd spent plenty of time overseas before that this book was completely untrue. I mean, this wasn't going to be a world that just came together because everyone wanted to trade and it would all turn out to be the same. In fact, there were very different and deeply divergent views of reality, of the past, the present, and the future, that I think probably one did have to have an ability in the language, an ability to communicate with regular people in order to understand that. But that began what became a long-term journey for me, to learn the languages, to live in the countries, to be not in an office park in Beijing or Shanghai, but in the countryside and traveling by trucks, cargo ships, living in villages, staying with people, hearing how people actually saw the world, and realizing that there was so much more depth to it than our concept of the 21st century, the end of history, the world is flat, all this stuff that I think was concocted and untruthful. And I think today, a decade and a half later, we're in a world where we're seeing that, in fact, the complexity of the world and that we're dealing with major states that have very different views of how where they're going and where we're all going in the future. And many of those views, I think, are very, very dangerous, which is why I wrote China's Vision of Victory, to explain the global grand strategy of the Chinese Communist Party in their own documents and words, which I've spent a lot of years working with. This is going to define the road ahead. We have to be able to understand these places and counter them, and in some cases rebuild our position in the world. So my journey's been probably about 20 years since first entering a language classroom at Columbia to learn a tier 1 difficult language, and then going on through all kinds of things since then.
One of the things you talked about this morning when we were over at the lab was how perhaps Americans really don't understand or appreciate the degree of Chinese nationalism, especially among the young people.
Sure, and I think this is something that we're going to learn about, soon enough. And on one hand, we're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, which is an authoritarian government that's been in power since 1949, that's considered America to be its adversary since really even before the Korean War. That went through a period that they called hide your brightness, bide your time, to build up economic power, and that now we're dealing with a dictator. I don't think it's appropriate to call him President Xi Jinping. He's actually Communist Party Chairman Xi Jinping, who seeks to overpower the United States in a long-term contest. And I think that at this point that's a matter of sort of known evidence-based work. There are plenty of people that have shown us that, including my own work on that. But then the other side of this is that we have the fact that the party has controlled the national narrative for multiple generations now. So when I used to meet people my age in China that would talk to me about going to war with different countries and things like this that you wouldn't expect to hear, it was obviously a great surprise, but it was also not that surprising when one also listened to the radio and read the newspapers and watched the television in Chinese language. Today we're hearing much more of that in English from the central government, but we're going to have to deal with another side to this, which is popular Chinese nationalism that is, has a military edge, and that has been really taught by the party, especially after Tiananmen Square. After 1989, when there were Chinese students who, carried the papier-mâché goddess of democracy through the streets and were gunned down by the party, the CCP began what they call the patriotic education program to ensure that generations of young people, would not see the party as an enemy or as an opponent or as something that could be overthrown, and instead would put in external enemies such as Japan, the United States, the West. So I encountered some of that at a street level in ways that were, pretty notable. And I think we're going to learn more about that as we begin to realize the nature of this competition.
The title of your book, of course, is The Decisive Decade. Why is this period of time so critical?
Right, so it's really in a way in a response to my first book, China's Vision of Victory, which laid out the Communist Party's long-term vision in their own words. It tracked their actual time frames. They have a clear idea of the future broken into different pieces. And the two centenaries of the founding of the Communist Party, and then the founding of the People's Republic of China in 2021, 2049 respectively, then a turning point in 2035. And initially, I wanted to call the book 2049, which is when they saw themselves as completing what they call the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And I realized that was not going to make sense to an American audience. It's just way too far off. So I began to think about the practical implications of this and the fact that we really have to win this. And I mean win, and we'll talk about that. I don't think it's as scary as we might think. But by 2030, we just need America to utilize the 2020s to set in the bedrocks for a long-term approach to this so that we can head off the party timeframes. And I think it's very interesting, but the phrase, the decisive decade, wound up in the U.S. national security strategy in the first paragraph written by the President of the United States. But it was a speech I gave to the Pentagon, to the Joint Staff Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Program in 2 years prior to that, called The Decisive Decade, U.S China Competition in the 2020s. So it's in my first book, talking about how we really, for all intents and purposes, they have this very long-term vision, but we have this very brief moment, and I think in history a decade is rather brief, in which to regain what it takes to ensure that their plans don't come to fruition. So we need the 2020s. We need to get a little bit longer term in our own thinking and activities, and just utilize this decade in order to set the groundwork for a longer 21st century in which we are able to prevent, many of their strategies from succeeding.
Before we get to really what is the thesis of your book, when you look at the 1990s, early 2000s, without our assistance, China clearly would not be where it is today. We were the ones that helped them join the WTO. We wanted them to be a responsible stakeholder, I think is the word that was often used. So were we just duped?
Well, it takes two to tango, and I think we had some very misconceived ideas of China. And on one hand, that's right. I mean, they were basically an agrarian economy in the 1980s, and by opening our markets to them, transferring our technology, transferring our capital, bringing them into the global economy with the objective of making them a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder. Exactly, that's one phrase that a senior American official used. But the theory was if they became rich, they would liberalize. And in fact, what we've wound up with is quite the opposite. We've wound up with the most probably advanced technological and industrial state we've ever had to deal with as an opponent. An opponent is a pretty polite word when you understand some of what they are planning and have in mind. But to give an example, and one of the ones I use in the book, is in the 1930s, the United States was double the industrial output of Japan and Germany combined. Today, we're 15% of global manufacturing output, and China is 30%. So they have effectively doubled the industrial economy that we have. We have more advanced capital markets. We have more advanced science and technology in certain states, so that's now very contested. None of this would have happened without our theory of engagement. And you mentioned the Kissinger quote, and I heard very recently from a friend of his that he is very concerned about his legacy.
So let's now get a sense of what you're proposing. Is it containment, like what we did with the Soviet Union somewhat successfully?
So the strategies that I've proposed in the Decisive Decade, I broke it down into the classic arenas of American grand strategy. When we think about grand strategy, which means basically a strategy for the whole thing, how do you deal with the entire picture? We talk about it's classically called the DIME, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. So I've broken it into those arenas and reverse the order to what I think is most important. Because the way I see it, we have to achieve three things. We have to ensure that the United States is the largest and most effective economy in the world. That's number one. Two, we have to unite the alliance system and the democracies in sort of common cause in this geopolitical moment. And that has to do not only with China, but also with Russia. We have a Russia-China axis that's forming, so getting the democracies to work as one team. And three, maintaining military superiority over Russia and China. China most importantly, because they're the ones that have invested far more than the Russians, but they work together on this. So if we can remain the largest economy, if we can unite the democracies, and if we can maintain military superiority, and then let the 21st century play out, sort of continuing to do those things, I think you head off this whole authoritarian challenge, you preserve American and allied power, and that's really what triumph means. It's preventing them from realizing what they see as triumph, which is to achieve what they call the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, to achieve what they call the community of common destiny of mankind, to complete the Belt and Road, to complete military modernization, all the strategies that they have, which are actually very sophisticated and effective in many ways. So if we can prevent all that, that's how we win. And most importantly is the economic arena. Because that's our history as a superpower. Really the story of the United States is that we became the world's largest economy in the late 19th century, and ever since then we have been completely unchallenged, notwithstanding the sort of Japan concerns in the 1980s, which I'm sure will come up in our discussion today. But we were, again, so much greater in size than the Axis powers of the Second World War. And we were always more than double the Soviet Union, so we always had that. And I use a quote from Secretary Bob Gates, the defense secretary, where he talks about America's strategists in the Cold War were in fact not economic strategists and thought very little about economics. And he named a bunch of people who we think of as great strategists and leaders, and they were in their sense. But they could always take for granted America's economic power. And that's what's different about this one. If we let that go, it will be something that we have had for 150 years, and we have never entered into conflict ever with a state with equal or greater economic power since the War of 1812, when, and obviously this is not the kind of world that we should ever contemplate. So if we're able to preserve the economic side, if we're able to prevent their economic strategies from coming to fruition, then I think we have the chance at doing this in a way that's both peaceful, this is not about a military conflict, but also that allows our system to prevail. And our system being one that's built on human rights, on the rule of law, on constitutional democracy, and all the things that I think we generally consider good. But we have to preserve the economic side, and that in turn translates into military power. I mean, it is the basis for military power. And if we lose that, we're going to see, as we've seen in the last 20 years, the military balance in the Pacific has transformed just dramatically. But it would transform even more. And that's the sort of world I think we want to prevent. But again, the actions we take in this decade are not only important to what takes place in this, in the 2020s, but far beyond that. The geopolitics of the decades ahead could be, pretty unthinkable if we don't preserve the strengths we have.
When we think back to the Cold War with the Soviet Union, it was military and ideology. With China, it strikes me that it's economic, and now increasingly military. But does ideology play a role?
It absolutely does, and I agree. I think it's really, it's going to be won or lost in the economic arena. There's going to be a high chance of military confrontation. They're telling us that openly. They talk about how China must prepare to fight and win wars and prepare to fight the bloody battles of our era. It's a pretty, sort of graphic set of rhetorical devices they use. But ideology is really important here, because the basic idea, and my first book, China's Vision of Victory, is about that. It's the idea that animates what the Communist Party calls the mission. And the mission is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It began essentially with Mao's New China, where he said China has stood up. We were humiliated by foreign empires. We were humiliated for 100 years. I mean, that idea predates him a little bit. But now we will establish the new China, a China that cannot be, taken advantage of by foreigners. And then that later turned into what's called the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and that's where Xi Jinping fits into it. He's the heir to that, as Mao believed he was the heir to Sun Yat-sen. But this idea of China's return and restoration, of China moving back to, as they say, the central position in world affairs, to basically building an international system with them at the center or at the top of a hierarchy. That is an idea, and it's ideological. And they also consider, our value system to be a threat to that. So there's a document, which I've included in both books actually, called Document Number 9, where they talk about different concepts in the West that they consider dangerous in the quote-unquote ideological sphere. And that includes human rights, constitutional democracy, free press, historical nihilism, which means denying the history as narrated by the Communist Party. And it's a whole list of things so we may not think of it as ideological, but in fact it is. And I think there's another side to it that, they still call themselves a Communist Party. I mean, that's a big topic of discussion and debate, because they obviously learned how to get rich. As Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter if a cat is white or black, it just matters that it catches mice. So they onboarded some features of capitalism, but they also have the sort of teleology of history here, in the same way that the communists and the Soviets believed that at the end of history it would be communism that won. I think there is this idea in the Communist Party of China that at the end of history China wins. So that, I think, is also an idea.
So clearly we cannot win this economic battle by ourselves. And so in your book you talk on practically every page about the need to form an alliance. Talk more about that, and when you do that, before you respond, let me read a quote from Charles Kupchan, who has a wonderful piece in The Atlantic this week. The difference from the Cold War is that it was bipolar, and the world is now multipolar, where many countries, including emerging heavyweights, India, Indonesia, will refuse to take sides.
Sure, and So on one hand, the alliance system is an incredible feature of American power. This is a system of mostly parliamentary democracies all across the world that work together in our shared defense. NATO alone is 50% of global GDP. You add the other democracies, including some of our major allies, like Japan and Australia, South Korea, all treaty allies with the U.S., you start to get about 60% of global GDP. You get to India. I have a doctorate in China-India relations. I think India will choose sides, actually. And Indonesia, which was non-aligned in the Cold War, matters a great deal. It's a $1 trillion economy with 200 million people. And to bring them to our side, I think, is also feasible. Maybe not in an overt way, but they have territorial overlaps with China. I've actually been up in those islands on a cargo ship when I was 23, going through the Natuna chain on my way to Borneo on an Indonesian boat. And, I think Indonesia will turn out to be a place that we really must engage in a very serious way, but one that could, see that the free world construct is far better for its long-term interests. So, is it multipolar? Multipolar is an interesting thing. This is actually a discussion I've had with Indian, diplomats many times, where, they love the idea of the multipolar world, the transition from unipolar American power to a series of major powers. It's something that Putin likes also, by the way. But what it really means, and that's one of the things you want to put these two together, and maybe it's not such a great idea. But a multipolar world is actually a very, very dangerous world, and I think it's the wrong construct to aspire to. I don't think it's necessarily one that actually exists yet. What you really want, in my view, and this is something that Winston Churchill talked about and Paul Nietzsche in our own strategic tradition talked about, but preponderance, where you basically have one side is the overwhelming side. And that side should be the free world, and the free world economically and militarily, including great democracies such as India and Indonesia, and certainly our treaty allies from Japan to Britain to all sorts of others. That's a construct that could lead to having the world's dictatorships think twice about any sort of temptation to use force, as we're already seeing play out. The weaker the cohesion, the more temptation traditionally that dictators have to pursue their territorial ambitions.
I'm sure there are other fans of Morning Joe in the room. I know David Schulman, you listen to him and watch sometimes. And Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, at least for another 10 days or so, said that one of the curious things that you're seeing in U.S. foreign policy and in China is that there's almost two tracks. The military track and the economic political track. Secretary Blinken will be going to China, I guess, the day after tomorrow. How do you reconcile, in both of our countries, this different paths that the military and the sense the politicians are taking?
Well, sure. This is why we need a grand strategy, and we really haven't had one since the early Cold War. The most famous example is George F. Kennan with his long telegram. He was not only the person to explain the challenge of the Soviet Union as a Sovietologist, not as a non-linguist, non-observer, but he also created the doctrine of containment, which really won the Cold War. And for whatever the ups and downs we had, that was essentially an idea that could be passed on from administration to administration, across a long arc of 50 years, and ultimately result in a peaceful victory in the Cold War, compared to many of the possible outcomes, which were very dark to think about. So, back then we came up with a strategy pretty early on, and today we really don't have one, and I think we really haven't had an effective American grand strategy since the early Cold War. So, everything needs to play a part, and that's why when you take the arenas from economics to diplomacy to military to ideas and have them start to work around a coherent concept, coherent outcomes, how they complement each other, it's how this is done when it's done right. But most importantly, what America needs is an economic strategy, because that's what we're really lacking. Our military strategy, our tradition is really about peace through strength, deterrence, trying to prevent war from having greater military power than another side, or at least enough to prevent them from taking actions. But on the economic side, again, we have just very rarely had that be the leader in our strategic thinking. And a lot of that, I think, is because of our setup with the private sector and the government, which is healthy. I mean, that leads to growth, that leads to innovation, it leads to all kinds of good things. But in a time of economic competition, we're going to need our private sector to begin to think along the lines of the national interest and the long-term consequences for the United States. And this is where the last 6 years that I've spent working with major American companies, working with corporate economists, CEOs, boards, all kinds of people, from pension funds to investment banks to semiconductors to nuclear submarines, and seeing how the economy works from not a sort of theoretical level, but from real-world participants. That's where so much of our strength and power is, and it is also how we won the major contests of the past. So I think that's an adjustment we're going to have to make, is to start to have business leaders. And H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, wrote the foreword to my book and addressed it to the business leaders of the free world, which I asked him to do because I think that's who needs to, Washington is learning this, is starting to really get, a very clear sense of how this works, but we need our private sector also to understand this so that our economic engines, which are many of the sources of our greatest strength, can also contribute to our long-term security.
Let me jump in here because I'm going to channel for a minute that I'm the CEO of a large public company, and I have my shareholders, and I have an obligation to them to turn a profit. And right now, you're in a situation where the Secretary of Defense cannot get the Minister of the Army, PLA, to return a phone call. And yet, in the last few days, you've had Bill Gates, Jamie Dimon, Musk, everybody else go, kiss the hand, if you wish. So how can we in this country put enough pressure or have the private sector understand the imperative nature that you're talking about?
Sure, and I've included, I think, in the first 10 pages, Elon Musk, Jamie Dimon, all their quotes about they believe China will be larger than the United States as an economy. So our business leaders are doing this for a reason. And that's the thing that we're going to have to figure out. I mean, I think the thing that I've learned about America as a historian of Asia, not of the United States, we're incredibly good, I think, at figuring things out once we've figured out what we need to figure out. And that's going to be the adjustment we have to make. How do we get private sector leaders to see this problem? And I think on one hand, that's done purely in the corporate interest. I mean, if they're able to see where this is going, if they're able to see the kinds of risks that they're taking on by definition in the China market, some of which are more dangerous than others, depending on the sector, depending on the company, realizing that this is actually going in a more competitive, more challenging, more fractious direction, the business decisions become different. The cost of capital allocation over there becomes very different, once you see where this is going. And I think Ukraine changed the minds of a lot of people. Jamie Dimon, who's I think is very interesting because he talks about this publicly, talks about how much Ukraine changed his thinking. And, 3 years ago, he would say, you don't want CEOs doing foreign policy. This year, he's saying national security matters the most. No business leader's ever said that in public record. That is a change. If we can get business leaders thinking that, and I think there's also the question of the other side of this, which we basically let go of human rights as a priority. I mean, after Tiananmen Square, we could have had a completely different approach to China. Instead, we said, no, we're going to trade with you. We hope this doesn't disrupt relations. And the next thing, you've got the WTO, you've got supply chains based over there, you've got massive economic growth, military buildup, Xi Jinping, here we are today. So the human rights side is incredibly important. Many different organizations around the world have done excellent research about our companies, not only in the United States, but across the world's democracies that are tied into the supply chains of China's concentration camps and forced labor and all of that. So essentially, that's become our supply chain. You're talking about dozens and dozens of companies. I've listed many examples here that are taken from, leading research institutes around the world. So the human rights side is one reason for our companies to start to think different, and national security is the other. And that kind of decision-making at a board level, and then asset owners, so pensions and 401ks and all of this, who are in fact the owners of publicly traded corporations, and that's typically how the ownership structure breaks out, need to also be asking the question of China risk. I mean, how are you putting our invested capital at risk by taking on certain activities over there? And then there's the government side, all the things that the government can do to change the behavior of companies. And this doesn't mean the end of growth or the end of our economic growth. I mean, quite the contrary. We still have a very vast world economy in which to, do business. And I think we have just as important a job of rebuilding U.S. supply chains, rebuilding the U.S. industrial base, investing in our strategic industries and critical technologies. So there's a lot of investment here and in the alliance system that will lead to growth and jobs and opportunity. But the problem we've got is as Elon Musk said, we're co-joined twins with China. That's not a good place to be. That's the thing that we have to fix fundamentally, I think, in the 2020s. That and real, solid, integrated deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. If you get those things right in this decade, you earn the next decade. If you get those wrong, people ask me about my third book, and I'm going to give everybody a chance to get those right first.
Jonathan, how would China respond if we were able to follow some of the suggestions and proposals that you have articulated?
Well, it depends on how well we do. It depends on how effective we are at managing those two problem sets, both the military deterrence side and the economic disengagement side. You cannot do one and not the other. Each has different consequences, and you can't do neither. So they are already pursuing their own form of, decoupling, which is they call it dual circulation. That's their strategy, where they seek to make themselves less dependent on the external economy and less dependent on external technologies and supply chains. I talk about this a lot in the new book with their documents and thinking. While at the same time tying the world's supply chains closer to China. So they have their own method of doing this, and I think we're, in that sense, they're responding already.
So there's different phrases we hear now: decoupling, de-risking, high fence. What should we do?
Well, I think you have to, the way that I would look at it, and in a way each of those phrases is a description of the same thing. I mean, it's all about how do we manage the economic risks of, global engagement with a place that is geopolitically an adversary. And I think it's really about restructuring the world economy. I mean, forget about the phraseology we have today. I mean, think about restructuring it so that it depends far less on the People's Republic of China. And there's one way to look at this, what's already being said, for example, in the White House. The Biden administration's first major document was the 100-day supply chain review, where they tasked multiple government agencies with 4 sectors: semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, pharmaceuticals, and then critical minerals and rare earths. And they said, how do we fix this? How do we fix these supply chains so that we're not dependent on potential adversaries? So we have that, but I think it has to go broader. I mean, it's also trying to rebuild our position as a major manufacturing power, as a major industrial base, as even having the capacity to be the arsenal of democracy, and ensuring that we still have that overall industrial capability. So the long and short of globalization is China became the manufacturer to the world, and we became the principal market for that supply chain. And we fix that, change that, use U.S. demand, because we're still the world's largest market. Use that to engage other countries that are friends, allies, and potential friends and allies. I mean, for instance, Indonesia. I mean, if we're worried about who's taking sides, I mean, imagine the power of the U.S. market engaging with Indonesia's economic potential. And those are the kinds of relationships we could have if we're not just getting all of that from an adversary state.
Before we open it up to our members and friends, I want you to comment some on the Belt and Road Initiative, because there certainly is now some reluctance and maybe buyer's remorse from some of the countries that have taken a lot of Chinese money or taken debt, but still China has very deep tentacles into particularly countries in Africa and in South America. So how is that handled?
Absolutely. So the Belt and Road, and this was a huge subject in my first book, because one of the things I wanted to prove in China's vision of victory was that it was a global vision. This wasn't just Taiwan, it wasn't just the island chains. It was a fully global strategic and military vision. And the Belt and Road is really both an economic and a military project. I mean, they've told us about how their defense strategies will be about defending their overseas interests. They've had military exercises to defend and protect, practice protecting Belt and Road infrastructure and ports. So it's all in there. And the bottom line is it's an economic strategy that seeks to link, Europe, Asia, Africa, and now Latin America and the Arctic to China, with China as the world's economic center. And it's basically done through investment, through state-owned enterprises, and through infrastructure building. And they've invested over the past 15 years, roughly $950 billion in this, all across the Belt and Road countries alone. We're not in that game. Their policy banks dwarf our overseas investment, whether it's aid or trade or any of it. And partly that's the lack of an American vision for the emerging world. And I broke my diplomatic chapter into two main pillars. One is consolidating the alliance system. The other is working towards having strategies for the major emerging regions, Latin America, Asia and the Indo-Pacific, obviously, and then, Africa. We have to have economic engagement strategies there, and we have to be able to deploy capital, meet infrastructure needs, and build relationships in a way that's strategic. And I think a combination of private sector capital and something like a U.S. and allied sovereign wealth fund or infrastructure investment bank, where we can go in and engage with these countries by providing real alternatives that lead to growth, that lead to development, and that are offering a choice here between China's state capital, where countries are learning what happens when that ends. This has already sort of always been known. They're going to bank the asset, then own the asset once it can't be repaid.
But when you look at China's history over the last 50 years, how could the CCP or even the Chinese population sort of sit back and say, okay, we'll be happy being second, when they really have been told that we have an opportunity to be number one? And after you respond to that, we'll open it up.
Sure, and if our problem here is that they're unhappy with anything other than number one, then maybe that tells us everything we need to know. And there are two elements to this. One is what...
Well, also, we're not happy. We don't want to be number two.
And I think it has a lot to do with the outcomes of the 21st century. What kind of future are we going to have? Are we going to have a future where the 21st century, as the Communist Party sees it, belongs to China, or are we going to have one that is U.S. allied, democratic, and otherwise? Those are the stakes of the whole thing. And if they're not happy with that, that's where we are. And I don't think we can accept China's vision of victory, or the community of common destiny, or the territorial conquests that they have in mind. This is going to be a very dark century if we don't do something.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you very much for being with us and talking about your book.